When Zane opened his eyes, he was greeted not by the familiar ceiling of his apartment but by rough wooden beams and the scent of drying herbs hanging overhead. Memories that did not belong to him flooded his mind all at once, and his expression slowly turned blank with disbelief. He had transmigrated. Worse, he had transmigrated into a Wuxia BL novel he had read shortly before dying. Even worse, he was not the protagonist. He was a minor healer named Zane who lived quietly on the outskirts of Qingyun village and died before the first major arc even began. The original Zane had existed for less than 2 chapters. His role had been simple: treat villagers, refuse to help an injured bandit, and die tragically to demonstrate how cruel the martial world could be. Zane refused to accept such a ridiculous fate. If fate expected him to die in Chapter 9, then fate could file a complaint. His little clinic stood beside a bamboo grove near the mountains. It was peaceful and isolated, surrounded by medicinal herbs and a small vegetable garden. Compared to modern traffic and office work, it felt almost heavenly. For several months, he enjoyed his new life. He treated fevers, gathered herbs, helped elderly villagers with aching joints, and slowly became an accepted member of the village. Then one stormy night changed everything. The rain fell heavily against the roof when Zane heard the sound of a horse collapsing outside his home. He grabbed a lantern and hurried into the storm. A black horse stood trembling near the edge of the forest while its rider lay unconscious in the mud. The man was badly wounded. Sword injuries covered his body, poison lingered in his bloodstream, and his breathing was dangerously shallow. Then Zane noticed the black jade ring on the man's finger. His heart nearly stopped. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Lyde, the infamous Demon Sect Leader who had vanished from the Jianghu years before the events of the novel. The man known as the Blood Sovereign. The monster responsible for countless deaths. The villain whom even righteous sects feared. Zane looked down at the unconscious man and sighed. "If I leave you here, you'll die," he muttered. The rain continued to pour. "Unfortunately for both of us, I'm a healer." Dragging an unconscious martial arts master through a storm turned out to be considerably more difficult than novels suggested. By dawn, Lyde's fever had broken and his condition had stabilized. When Zane woke later that morning, the bed was empty. A cold voice sounded behind him. "Who are you?" Zane turned and froze. Lyde stood by the window, holding a knife to his throat. Even pale from blood loss, he carried an overwhelming presence. His dark eyes were calm and ancient, as though they had witnessed too many deaths to be surprised by anything anymore. "You know who I am," Lyde said quietly. "Yes. And yet you saved me." "Also yes." "Why?" Zane considered the question seriously. "Because it was raining." For the first time, confusion crossed Lyde's expression. Zane shrugged. "You looked miserable." Silence filled the room. Eventually Lyde lowered the knife. "You are foolish." "Probably. You should fear me." "I do." Lyde raised an eyebrow. "You do not look afraid." "That's because you're currently standing in my house wearing my clothes after I stitched your wounds closed." Lyde glanced down at the healer's robes he had been dressed in. "Those robes I was wearing before were expensive." Zane stared at him. "You're upset about the robes." "They were custom made." Zane laughed so hard he nearly fell over. It was the first time in decades that someone had laughed in Lyde's presence without fear. For reasons he couldn't explain, he stayed. Days became weeks. Weeks slowly became months. The infamous demon lord learned how to feed chickens, repair fences, collect herbs, and brew tea. To Zane's shock, Lyde became strangely invested in farming. "The cabbages are growing unevenly," Lyde said one morning with a frown. "You once destroyed an entire sect." "The cabbages concern me more." Little by little, the terrifying figure known throughout the jianghu began to disappear. In his place remained only Lyde. A tired man who had spent too many years surrounded by blood and violence. A man who had forgotten what peace felt like. One evening, while watching the sunset over the mountains, Lyde spoke quietly. "I don't remember when I stopped wanting to live." Zane sat beside him in silence. Neither of them noticed when the distance between them slowly began to disappear. Rumors spread quickly through the jianghu. Someone had seen the missing Demon Sect Leader. Someone had witnessed an impossibly powerful martial artist living quietly near Qingyun village. Someone had noticed a dangerous man watering vegetables. Unfortunately, the last rumor turned out to be true. Righteous sect disciples began appearing in the nearby towns asking questions. Zane worried constantly. Lyde remained perfectly calm while harvesting cabbages. "You don't seem concerned," Zane said. "They have searched for years. They found you. They found my vegetables." That was somehow worse. Life continued despite the danger. They gathered herbs together. They brewed tea in the evenings. Lyde learned to cook while Zane learned that a former demon lord approached cooking with the seriousness of military strategy. The dumplings are asymmetrical. They're food. They represent failure. The dumplings don't care. I care. Somewhere along the way, their little house stopped feeling temporary. It became home. Then everything changed in a crowded marketplace. A drunken martial artist grabbed Zane's wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Before Zane could react, another hand wrapped around the man's arm. Lyde stood beside him. His expression was calm. Too calm. "You touch my husband with that hand?" he asked softly. Zane's brain immediately stopped functioning. "Husband? When had that happened?" The drunk laughed mockingly. The next second his arm hung uselessly at his side. Lyde released him without changing expression. "Do not touch what belongs to me." The entire marketplace fell silent. For a brief moment Zane caught a glimpse of the man Lyde used to be. Not the farmer. Not the tea enthusiast. Not the man who complained about cabbage quality. The monster. The demon lord. The man who had terrified the martial world. That single incident was enough to reveal Lyde's identity. Soon dozens of martial artists surrounded their home. Old enemies stood before him carrying decades of hatred and grief. "You murdered my brothers. You destroyed my sect. You ruined countless lives." Lyde listened quietly to every accusation. Then he looked toward Zane. "I should leave." Zane stared at him. "What?" "They want me, not you. So your solution is to disappear." It is the logical choice. It is a stupid choice. For the first time in his life, Lyde found someone standing between him and a drawn sword. Zane stepped forward without hesitation. "They don't get to decide whether you deserve peace." The word struck harder than any blade. Because Lyde had never once believed he deserved peace. Not until now. Spring returned to the mountains. The herb garden flourished. The chickens multiplied. Lyde continued his endless war against imperfect vegetables. Life moved forward quietly. One evening Zane finally asked the question that had been bothering him for months. About that husband comment in the marketplace. Lyde immediately looked away. It was strategically effective. Was it? Yes. You know, most people ask before promoting themselves. A faint blush appeared on Lyde's face. You didn't object. Zane found the expression so unexpected that he laughed. The feared Demon Sect Leader looked nervous. Actually nervous. Somehow that was more shocking than all the terrifying stories he had heard. Their relationship changed naturally after that. Lyde began waiting outside the clinic whenever Zane worked late. Zane started preparing 2 portions of every meal without thinking about it. The quiet domestic moments slowly became precious. Then came the first bouquet. Lyde placed several wildflowers on the table with all the confidence of a man preparing for battle. "I found these nearby." "Did you?" "The arrangement has symbolic meaning." "What meaning?" "I don't know." Zane laughed until tears formed in his eyes. Years passed peacefully. Occasionally assassins arrived hopping to claim the legendary Demon Sect Leader's life. Occasionally someone threatened the healer who lived beside him. Those people tended to disappear shortly afterward. One particularly unfortunate assassin woke up tied upside down in a tree several provinces away. Another retired from martial arts entirely and opened a noodle shop. The jianghu eventually learned an important lesson. Do not disturb the healer in the mountains, especially if you value your limbs. One evening Zane and Lyde sat outside drinking tea as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Your water temperature is wrong, Lyde said. Zane stared at him. You can actually tell. Obviously. You're terrifying. I know. For a while they sat together in comfortable silence. Eventually Zane spoke. Do you miss it? The jianghu. The power, the fear, the throne. Lyde looked toward the fields they had planted together. Toward the clinic they had built into a home. Toward the man sitting beside him. Then he shook his head. No. The world remembered Lyde as a monster. History remembered him as a villain. Perhaps those things were true. But none of them mattered here. Here he was simply Lyde. A farmer. A husband. A man learning how to live again. And every morning he woke beside the person who had dragged him out of the rain and stubbornly refused to let him disappear. The jianghu called him a demon. Zane called him home.